Greetings, everyone. I hope you're doing well, and thank you so much for the wonderful welcome. And thanks to everyone in the room for joining this session. I will be speaking about the topic displayed, Singing with Paul, a case for Cruciform-Doxological theology. And you might be wondering why we are going down this route. And I would like to open up by saying music plays an integral part to many of our lives. So we carry songs that transmit memory and also galvanize communities depending on occasion or context. So it is with that frame that we'll broadly sketch that we will launch into what I've prepared for us today. We'll have a time where we'll hear from other individuals within the academic team who will share with us some items that we are preparing for the coming few months. So at that moment in time, I'll be inviting them to switch on their cameras and to share what they have to share. And then they'll bring back the mic to me, and then we'll bring it to a time of Q&A. So that's where we are going in a broad brush stroke. So allow me to just change a few things here on my screen as we begin with today's address. So, reading from the beginning of what I prepared, we know allegorical and historical grammatical approaches. We know the quadriga and glossa ordinaria. We know Pesher readings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Septuagint. We know intertextuality, midrashic readings, and Mishnah. We know the Targums and the Talmud. We know historical criticism, text criticism, redaction criticism, source criticism, form criticism, and ideological criticism. We know narrative criticism, canonical criticism. We know source criticism and rhetorical criticism. We know social scientific criticism, socio-rhetorical criticism, and social identity approaches. We've been doused in Marxist readings, feminist readings, ecological readings, post-colonial readings, philosophical readings, and contextual readings. This is a snippet of the world of biblical studies, a world that shapes the modes and interpretations of the Bible. Viewed from the long train of history, some may say this world is impartial, even a natural progression of academic advancement. Yet when viewed from the vantage point of the church, there are disconnects and discontinuities that this presentation observes about this world. Cornelia, please can you advance my slides for me? My screens have just changed. In other words, despite all that the theologian and biblical scholar have come to know, despite our methodological prowess and analytical precision, more than ever before, the church is asking the seminary and the university the most basic of questions. Does it preach? This presentation will make a case for a cruciform doxological theology, arguing that in scholarship, just as in the church, the theologian and biblical scholar are responsible for retrieving the homiletical heart of theology. In fact, this address will go far as positing that the loss of this heart and the complicit minimizing of the same by believing scholars has relegated scholarly outputs from the seminary and the global south to margins of academic preference. This has created an academic ghetto wherein readings that are from and for the church are considered not critical enough. Tied to the question, does it preach, is another question proceeding from Pauline tendency. Like the eroded homiletical heart, the tendency to restrict theological engagement to the noetic or intellectual and abstract is a hallmark of modern scholarly outputs. Yet, when we read Paul's letters, Songs rich in theology are weaved into the metastructure of his theological treatise. These songs are not just songs, but they spill over into the life and practical realities of the church. Paul's doxological tendency is neither coincidental nor contrived. In fact, it is the natural outflow of his participation in the gospel and anchorage in the Christ event. So, to our first question, does it preach? We add a second. Does it sing? Do our theological outputs move the heart to worship? Do our theological outputs move the hands to action? Do our theological outputs move our feet to acts of justice and mercy? To answer these questions, we shall explicate cruciformity as a posture of reading that is efficacious in reading the homiletical, in retrieving the homiletical heart of theology and the doxological rhythms of Christian scholarship. We shall look briefly at Philippians 2 4 to 11, and from it inscribe some insights that may inform the practice of cruciform doxological theology at SATS. Moving on to the next slide that says theoretical framework. Theoretical framework. Excuse me, my screens just changed as I was beginning, so just going back to those. My apologies for that. Theoretical framework, cruciformity. The language of cruciformity looms large in Pauline thought and practice. Although the word is not found in the pages of Scripture, the conceptual framework saturates the hermeneutical trajectories of every biblical text, directly or indirectly. From it, we note dimensions of aspiration and appropriation delineated by the macro themes of soteriology and eschatology. Put another way, cruciformity is not abstract. It has a location, a primary protagonist, and secondary actors that draw their identity and function from the words and works of the main character. Michael Gorman defines cruciformity as conformity to the crucified Christ. He posits that cruciformity accords with the strange story of Christ crucified as the primary way of experiencing the love and mercy of God. End quote. He continues by noting how cruciformity has at its core a narrative spirituality into which followers of Christ are inducted. One may say cruciformity is the transformative imprint of the cross in the life, mission, and public engagement of a person and a community that is the church. Evident in this definition is the centrality of the Stavros, the cross, which when read in line with Richard Hayes' treatment of Mark is, and I quote, the singular redemptive event through which Jesus gives his life as a ransom for many, that's Mark 10:45, and a definitive pattern for the life of discipleship to which his followers are called, end quote. This presentation accords with Gorman's definition also, which says, and I quote, cruciformity is the spiritual, moral dimension of the death of Jesus by crucifixion found in Paul, in the rest of the New Testament, and throughout much of the Christian tradition. With respect to Paul, at least, this conformity to the crucified Messiah is not an abstract moral principle, but a spiritual or even mystical. And here, Gorman uses the term mystical to refer to that which is actually anchored in what God has done. And it is the encounters that are continuous between humanity and God that he labels as mystical. In other words, God is not like us. And so when we encounter him, there's a mystical reality that is captured. And that's how he uses the word there. This mystical reality is rooted paradoxically in a profoundly this worldly reality. Jesus' crucifixion and produces no less paradoxically a variety of very this worldly results. So, in other words, we can't speak of being cruciform and think of a world over there. But cruciformity actually has implications, direct implications in our lives here and now. We continue. Simply put, we cannot expound cruciformity without the cross. As much as we cannot use cruciform hermeneutics without recognizing the apocalyptic and epistemological uniqueness of the Christ event. Therefore, to read in cruciform modality is to employ the Stavros, the cross of Jesus, as a heuristic tool that interprets, reinterprets, and even conditions the ethical substance of the people of God, together with their mission and public theological expression. One may even venture to borrow from Paul's foregrounding of the Stavros in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 2, where he says, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." And the Greek is applied there. While some may consider Paul's approach an exercise in essentialism, what is undeniable is the centrality of the person of Christ and the event of the crucifixion. The cross is the interpretive key to all reality because through it, a new reality is inaugurated. This reality was prophesied by the prophets of old and was expected by faithful followers of Yahweh. A closer inspection of Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 2, looking at the second section, "Me Iesun Christon ke tavton estaromenon," underscores the cross as both a historical event and an epistemological foundation phenomenon. So, knowing nothing else except Jesus Christ crucified. This is based on Paul's use of the perfect passive participle estaromenon, which communicates a past completed act having continuing effect in the present. In other words, the crucifixion of Jesus is both a historical event and a dynamic act that affects the present, animating those who pledge allegiance to the King to become a new creation. Thus, although Jesus was crucified in weakness, his paradoxical crucifixion makes a universal watershed in which the cross reinterprets the past, the present, and even the future. It is this apocalyptic and epistemological uniqueness of the cross that forms the ground on which cruciformity stands. Further connected to the mention of the cross in 1 Corinthians is the event of the resurrection and its implications, as treated in 1 Corinthians 15. One may venture to note that both the cross and the resurrection function as thematic bookends in 1 Corinthians correspondence. In other words, the twin events are explicated in the treatment of the occasion, but are underlined to emphasize that which is central to Pauline theology. So when you look at 1 Corinthians, the first few chapters, Paul is speaking about, or he's foregrounding the cross as that which is all important to who the Corinthians are and how they became those who are called followers or saints in the family of God. And then at the end of Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 15, we hear him explaining what the resurrection is all about. And because these two are positioned at strategic points in Paul's letter, one may say that the cross and the resurrection function as thematic bookends to the entire correspondence. The cross and the resurrection are the GPS of theological adventure and the dictionary of theological inquiry. Without them, our theology becomes aimless, subjective, and dare I say, unchristian. Moving on to the next item, cruciformed by a song, an analysis of Philippians 2, verse 4 to 11. Reading Songs in Paul and the Early Church. Paul's use of early Christian songs in his letters is well documented. Passages such as Ephesians 5:18 to 21, Colossians 1:15 to 20, 3:15 to 17, which speaks about speaking to one another in songs, spiritual songs, also echoed in Ephesians. 1 Timothy 3:16 and Philippians 2:4 to 11 all communicate early Christian dependence on song, especially charismatic formation through song. While the Bible text attests to the widespread use of song, singing is also documented as a hallmark of early Christian believers. In a letter written to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, Pliny the Younger, who was governor of Bithynia around 111 to 113 AD, writes the following, and I quote, "They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day because it was light when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, by food of an ordinary and innocent kind." So Pliny continues, "Even this practice, however, they had abandoned often the publication of my edict, by which according to your orders I had forbidden political associations." So you can hear that Christianity was now being regarded as a political association, and he's writing to the emperor asking for advice on what to do with this peculiar group of people. He continues, "I judged it so much that the more necessary to extract the real truth with the assistance of torture from two female slaves who were styled deaconesses." Now, this passage is interesting because we can see that slaves actually were now occupying offices within the early church, and these two unnamed female slaves are styled as deaconesses even within the church. "But I could discover nothing more," he says, "than depraved and excessive superstition." This is Pliny the Younger, letters 1096, and it is quite a lengthy passage, and I've just taken this extract to demonstrate a few things related to our passage. From this fragment, we can deduce two items. First, the deity of Christ was evident to Pliny. Second, the ethical substance of the early Christians was inextricably linked to their liturgy. Other aspects worth noting from this letter are that two female slaves served as deaconesses, and that the worship of Christ was considered by the establishment as a direct affront to the emperor's worship, and a prevalent ideology within the first century. So we move on to look now at the Philippian hymn. And I'll read from Philippians 2, verse 4 to 11 within the ESV. "Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of man, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father." That's Philippians 2, 4 to 11 from the ESV. Philippians is a piece of Pauline correspondence written from prison. It's akin to letters from a Birmingham jail in its origin, in that it's written by somebody who's expecting to die. It's akin even to Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship. In it, Paul employs epistolary conventions of his day to communicate with a congregation that is dear to him. In fact, Thompson and Longenecker call it a hortatory letter of friendship. Now, a hortatory is that which is inclusive of a community. So there is this communal dynamic within the letter. One may say this is a letter in which the believing community as a whole functions as an interpretive key to the meaning of the text. In other words, to understand Philippians, one has got to pay attention to the communal dynamic within the letter. Paul writes to a group of people he knows. He addresses some individuals, but at the core of his writing is the communal attention. Keywords that define this letter are Christ, gospel, joy, partnership, partners, to mention but a few. And the very pertinent term phronesis or phronane, which speaks of a disposition or attitude. In addition, the cruciform way is presented in hues that converge most vividly in Philippians 2, 4 to 11. At the center of this passage is a crucible moment of death and resurrection. And as we hear this echo of death and resurrection, the death of Christ and his resurrection, we hear echoes of Paul, even in 1 Corinthians, telling us that the death and resurrection of Christ were central to Pauline theology. I move on now to look at adapting the way of a slave. Or adopting the way of a slave. Verse 7, but emptied himself by taking the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of men. While chapter 2, 4 to 11 can be taken as a unit, it is important to note that what Paul says in 2, 4 is already hinted at in the proemion, which is the preamble or the exordium, to use the Latin. Paul and Timothy have already presented themselves as duli Christi Jesu, slaves of Christ, in Philippians 1 verse 1, which according to epistolary conventions prepares the presentation of Christ as a slave in 2:7. Aristotle actually, in his work Rhetoric, says of the preamble, in those speeches and in epic poems, the introductions provide a sample of the story so that the listeners may know beforehand what it is about, and that the mind may not be kept in suspense. For what is indeterminate leads astray. So then, he who puts the beginning, so to speak, into the listener's hand enables him, if he holds fast to it, to follow the story. So when Paul uses the term slave of himself in Philippians 1 verse 1 rather, he's actually preparing the way for what he will say about Jesus Christ being a slave, who actually is a slave who goes to the point of dying. And this connection between 1:1 and 2:7 is not coincidental. It is deliberate, because Paul is saying the whole theme of being a slave or a servant of God is key to understanding what he's communicating to the Philippians themselves. One may argue that the hymn presents Christ in continuity with the Eved Yahweh, the slave of God motif, which is found across the pages of the Old Testament. In this motif, that refers to the relationship between Yahweh and key Old Testament figures. People are self-styled as servants of God who receive some form of honor, but actually serve as slaves of God within his economy. Examples of such figures include Moses, who is called a slave of God in 2 Kings 18:12, Joshua, who's called a slave of God or servant of God in Judges 2:8. David, who's called Eved Yahweh in 2 Samuel 7:5. And the prophets can go to Amos 3:7 and Zechariah 1:6, to mention but a few. Therefore, the use of the term doulos in Philippians 2:7 communicates humble service and disposition offered by Christ to Yahweh while positioning Christ in continuity with ancient servants of God. We continue. Cruciform theology and spiritual formation. An attitude of selfless service. Verse 6 of Philippians 2 says, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Thompson and Longenecker note the presence of poetic narrative of 2:6-11 within a sequence of imperatives and argue that this indicates that this is the conduct that is worthy of the gospel, that the conduct worthy of the gospel cannot be reduced to a series of rules, but is inseparable from the community's defining narrative. In other words, the Philippians are grafted into a story. And this story is not a story they only sing about, but it's a story that they live out in community. The narrative shapes the Philippians and is modeled after Christ himself. Christ descends to the human experience and condescends to become even the lowest among those within the human grouping, and he assumes the identity of a slave. And this is his condescension, which speaks about his self-abasement. But it is not only Christ who self-abases. Paul follows after Christ and presents himself as a slave of Christ. And in doing so, Paul calls other leaders within the church. And here we hear of Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Clement in chapter 2 and chapter 4, respectively. All these individuals are following after Christ's self-abasement. Therefore, Philippians provides the substance and attitude of doing theology in which the practitioner does not stand above or apart from the community that they serve. But like Christ, the practitioner enters the community they serve, integrates into that community as one of that community, and not only integrates, but serves even to the position of assuming the role of a servant or slave. Further, the theological posture of the practitioner or the leader is that of a servant who has rid themselves of any status or markers of status that cause separation or barriers between the community that they serve and themselves. Considered from a theological angle, cruciformity therefore helps us to understand that as we read Philippians 2, verses 4-11, a theology that leads to participation is always anchored in a gospel that sees Christ as condescended. So, as we consider what cruciformity looks like, the first invitation is for us to adopt that which Christ embodies, self-abasement. The question then becomes, what does cruciform theology look like at SATS? And here I would love to move first by positing that cruciform theology does not begin with a body of written works, but it begins with postures of condescending hearts. Condescending hearts are meaning that those who are abased or who are humble. I posit the first point, which is SATS lecturers, supervisors, and staff are to be disciples of Christ who boldly carry the moniker slave of Christ. In a climate where theological practitioners and academics vie for position, for tenure, and rightly so in some regards, the invitation is for us as an institution and practitioners to recall our primary moniker as Paul presents himself to the Philippians, slave. In a culture where theological enterprise opens up opportunities and accolade, the invitation of Paul and Philippians is that we assume the identity of a slave and carry the moniker slave of Christ boldly. Here, our reading or our production of academic work is limited to us knowing that we are not to elevate ourselves, nor to make names for ourselves, but to make our names less audible than that of Christ himself. The second point I want to highlight is cruciform theology at SATS looks like lecturers, supervisors, and staff being integrated and serving the church. It is an oxymoron to call a theologian when they do not belong to a community of believers. It is contradictory to do theology for a community that one is not invested in. It is contradictory to have a theology that one assents to when it is not tested, proven, or even appropriated within a community. And so, as we see Paul identifying with the Philippians, we are invited to be those who are integrated within communities of faith. A lecturer lectures fundamentally anchored as a community member. A supervisor supervises anchored in a community of believers. We are believers, disciples first, before we are lecturers and supervisors. The third point I want to highlight is such lecturers, supervisors, and staff are called to be resources to the church. Resources to the church. A cruciform theology therefore tells us that in our self-abasement, what we give to the church empowers the church, or should empower the church, should encourage the church, ultimately nurturing the church to conform to the very pathway of self-abasement and service to the broader society. A cruciform theology therefore marks us out as resources to the church. The final point I want to highlight here is SATS lecturers do theology for the purposes of forming Christian men and women. Our theology can only sing, our theology can only preach when it is connected to the Christian community. A theology that is distant from the professing, believing community is a theology that loses its ring of sound and worship. A theology that is not connected to a people who are Christians ultimately leads to a restriction within intellectualism. So, such lecturers and supervisors are first disciples of Christ, called to serve the church, called to be resources for the church, and called to do theology for the primary purpose of forming Christian men and women. Research is secondary. Writing is mandatory if it is for the formation of Christian men and women. And we hear here a quote from Benjamin Wayman, who says, "Good theological education helps us develop legs to dance to the holy chorus with the broad community of unlikely friends we call the church." May we, as practitioners, as preachers, but as seminary lecturers and professors and those who serve in the academy, participate in calling the church our friend, serving the church through a cruciform theology that brings about spiritual formation. So, as we consider these markers of what a cruciform doxological theology may be, I would love to invite a few of our team leaders at SATS. These are men and women who are responsible for key academic functions at SATS, who are doing a splendid job in leading our areas of academic expression. We have a team we call the course development team, led by Dr. Peter Labuskaghni, and I'm going to read 3 areas of focus that Dr. Peter Labuskaghni and his team will be focusing on in the coming year. The first one is on the BTH courses. So the courses of the BTH will be looked at, and the question is, how can we appropriate the Africa question? In other words, how can SATS develop BTH courses that serve the African context more effectively? So there will also be assessment and evaluation and proofreading of these courses. The second area that this team is focusing on is revising the lecturer training and student orientation and onboarding courses. As you can tell, these are key gatekeeping courses that help us to train lecturers, but also to orient students. And the last area of focus that this team will focus on is to develop an interactive teaching tool for the MDiv courses. And this is quite a demanding area, and this team has got the capacity and need our prayers as they focus on pushing these three foci for the year. I'm now going to call upon Dr. Jesse Kipimo, who's the head of the program delivery team, to sketch what this PDT will be doing in the next few months. Dr. Kipimo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bat, for this powerful presentation. We're really edified. Thank you so much. Let me just go quickly through the three focus areas for PDT in 2023. The first one will be holding a SATS Open Day. And this SATS Open Day has three purposes. The first purpose is that of getting in touch with people we serve in Africa. You know, we are an online seminary, and sometimes people don't know who we are, you know, meeting the people themselves. So we want to use this SATS Open Day to be a time when people can see people are behind the scene, and also to allow students and SATS partnerships to meet with us, to interact with us, to ask us questions, and then we'll be able to answer their questions. And above all, want to promote SATS programs to the public. And then number two, we'll be organizing a Students' Academic Integrity Conference. This is a very important gathering. I know as SATS, we normally have e-conferences, but this one will only be for students. We want to focus on the promotion of integrity in the academia. We have a big problem, the increase of plagiarism among our students as they submit their work and as we grade their assignments. So we want to use this platform to be a time when we'll be promoting ethics, Christian ethics, and integrity among our students as one way of combating plagiarism. And then the last one, we are writing a collective article as PDT, and this article will be focusing on pastoring students and then pastoring lecturers. So it's a double dimension type of work. Pastoring lecturers who can pastor students. The purpose is to bridge the gap between the academic aspect of our work as academics at SATS and also the ministerial aspect. So we want to bridge that gap. We don't want lecturers to only be scholars, only academics, but to be also ministers, to also be pastors, to be also people can serve the student that the Lord is entrusting us with. So yeah, in a nutshell, these are the three main areas of focus for PDT in 2023. Thank you so much, Dr. Bat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Jesse. We'll now invite Dr. Candida Miller to share with us the focus areas for the counseling team. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity, and good afternoon, everybody. So the three focus areas that the counseling team is really wanting to invest into is firstly in the undergraduate space. We're developing and shaping the existing courses to meet the needs, the current needs that we know of in the counseling field, and so that we can forward to put more counselors in more churches. That's the main goal. We're hoping to be able to become more high tech, more, what do we call it? Sorry, more high touch, high tech, because the numbers are going up in these courses, and we feel like we would like to engage more completely with our students in that space. So in the postgraduate development, we are creating the honors degree. At the moment, we have a few specializations in the honors space. One of them is Christian counseling, and so this course is actually, this program is being written, and it should be completed, and we have our first graduates that should actually be completing at the end of this year already. So that's a very exciting time for the counseling team. And then as far as strategic positioning goes, there's something that's very much on the heart of those who are working with Christian counseling students. And that is to meet with experts in the field of Christian counseling, to be able to engage in conversation about the cultural complexities in Christian counseling, so that we can find ways that SATS might meet the training needs of Christian counselors in Africa. And we feel like this is a very important part of our 2023 journey. So thank you for that. If you have any questions about that, you're welcome to engage with me through the email, and we'll take it from there. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Batts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. I'm going to invite the next team, that's the student research team, led by Dr. Falconer. So Rob, feel free, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'll put my webcam on so that you can see me. I hope you are all doing well. Okay, so we have these three parts or three goals. There are quite a few more goals, but this is the focus for 2023. The first one is to automate nexus for student research, and as we all know, we have Next, which Tim Churchill created for us for the undergrad students, and this would be almost like a phase 2, I suppose, for MDH and PhD students. So this plays into the idea of high tech touch, and it would track these students' progress as they write their MDH or their PhD, and also track their payments. But there's a lot more going on here. It is a integrated system, and it's certainly something that we are quite excited about as a team. We are expecting this within the next, I'm not sure about, I guess in the next 1 to 3 months or so. Then the second one is to revamp the MRS 5240 course. This is the student concept, the development course that we have in phase 1. This course helps prepare these students to move into phase 2 and to be supervised by students, helping them to have a good grasp and a good idea of what it is exactly that they want to research. Sean is involved in that. I'm involved too, but Sean he actually drives that program for that course. And so what we have agreed to do is to rewrite this course. I wrote it about 5 or 6 years ago, and we've learned so much since then. So we feel now is a good time to look at it and see how best we can serve our students through it. And we have some great ideas of what we want to do there. And what dovetails into that is the third part. So to introduce guided reading for sub-disciplines. There was some concern about when a student moves from phase 1 into phase 2, that they don't really understand how to go about doing their research for their specific field. And so this would help equip these students. So it would be certain books or articles or parts of books that students should read in phase one in this course to prepare them as they begin to research and then they move into phase two. So these points 2 and 3, there are two parts of one goal, if that makes any sense. Thank you, Bet.
Thanks so much, Rob. And that's news from the student research team. We now move on to the next team, which is a faculty research team led by Dr. Cornelia van der Venter. Cornelia, it's over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Manyika. Good afternoon again, everyone. So 3 priorities that I want to share today in the faculty research and publication team. So the first is about Conspectus, our academic journal, for those who don't know. Conspectus is very special to us. It is a space that we publish work in that honors scripture, that honors Christ, and that is relevant to the church. And then lots of our material is focused to serve Africa, to showcase African scholars, although not exclusively. So one of the priorities, as always, is to expand Conspectus's reach and readership, particularly in South Africa and Africa. And this includes, we have 2 minor strategies here that would contribute to that. The first is getting Conspectus accredited with the Department of Higher Education and Training. We've done most of the legwork here, but we are just waiting for that thumbs up, and I'm hoping that that will come through this month or next month, so watch the space. The next one is having Conspectus indexed on Africa Journals Online. Now, Africa Journals Online is the biggest journal library in Africa, or for African journals. And we are hearing some good sounds in that direction, but we still need to get the journal on that site. So I'll let you know when that happens. And I think that will be very special for Conspectus. The second thing also on Conspectus is to publish a special edition. This will happen around September, October this year. Now, what this special edition will contain is not academic articles, as we usually do, but book reviews on manuscripts that have recently been published by Langham Publishing. So we'll have the book reviews, I think of about 6 selected books, and then we'll have the responses by the authors themselves. So there'll be a bit of a dialogue about key resources that are coming from our continent. Again, evangelical resources that will serve the church well. So I'm very excited about this. I think it's going to showcase some good books and also showcase some excellent authors to keep an eye on. And hopefully our students will benefit from this as well. And then the third one is investment in writing skills. So this is across the board. While we are mostly responsible for faculty, we are also looking after our students, I hope. So we have 3 writing workshops. We already had one on Wednesday with Dr. Nijay Gupta. I think it was just an excellent workshop. 2 more scheduled, one in April, one in October. This is for faculty and postgraduate students. And then something of a small writing cohort. We haven't finalized it yet, but it's something that we want to launch perhaps around April, to work with selected SATS faculty and see them grow in this area of writing and publication. And then we haven't forgotten about our students. So you would be happy to hear that July is symposium, or is academic writing month on the symposium calendar. So we've blocked out the month of July, and instead of listening to presenters talk about theological topics, we are going to focus on writing and research as topics. 2 of the sessions will be for our undergrad students. Postgrad students are more than welcome to join, of course. And then the other 2 sessions will be aimed at the postgrad students. So we're hoping that this will serve us well and will develop us in these areas. Thanks, Dr. Manyika. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. van der Venter. Just going to reshare my screen here. So as you can hear, there's a lot of activity on in the academic wing of SATS. So we've heard from the different team leaders, the student research led by Dr. Falconer, faculty research and publishing led by Dr. van der Venter, counseling led by Dr. Miller, program delivery led by Dr. Kipimo, and course delivery led by Dr. Labuskachny. Read his 3 points because he's currently on leave, but we're delighted to have those included. So as we hear these areas of focus, the question that naturally comes is, will our outputs be doxological? Will they be informed by cruciform doxology? And the invitation is, as we venture into the year, proceed into the year, that we would harness that which Paul invites us to, which is to adopt the posture of slaves for Christ, servants for Christ, who are shaped by a desire to be resources for the church, to be those who help the church come to maturity. So in closing, a theology that sings and a theology that preaches is grounded in the believing community. We cannot theologize absent the believing community. The epistemology of the new creation produces the fruit of selfless service and communal solidarity when applied. Therefore, to retrieve the homiletical heart of theology, we are invited to adopt the cruciform way, where we self-abase as Christ did. To retrieve the doxological rhythms of Christian scholarship, we are invited to be engaged in the Christian community as disciples of Jesus Christ. And as we do, we pray that his kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you for listening.